A fully loaded container ship can weigh around 200,000 tons, about the weight of more than 1,000 blue whales. Now imagine the thing keeping it from drifting into a harbor wall. You're probably picturing something absurdly massive. But the anchor is only a tiny fraction of the ship's weight. So tiny that if weight alone were doing the job, the whole system would be a joke. And that's the secret. The anchor isn't doing this alone. It's just the hook at the end of a hidden machine. So what's the machine? Let's kill the biggest myth right away. People assume an anchor holds a ship by being heavy, you drop the big metal weight, it hits the bottom, the ship stops. Nope. If it worked like that, you'd need an anchor the size of an apartment building. Real anchors do something smarter. They hook. Those curved arms on the anchor are called flukes, and when the chain drags them sideways, they bite into the seabed and dig in. Pull harder, they dig deeper. Less like a paperweight, more like a claw sinking into the dirt. But the anchor's just the opening act. The real star spends its entire life underwater, which is exactly why nobody thinks about it: the chain. On a big ship, the chain weighs more than the anchor hanging off it. A single link can weigh hundreds of pounds. Picture a refrigerator, then picture a whole chain of them. Pick up one link and you'll notice a bar welded across the middle. That's called a stud. It keeps the link from deforming, helps stop the chain from kinking inside the ship, and adds weight. That last part sounds boring. It's not. The weight of the chain is about to become the whole story, because even the strongest chain on Earth is useless unless the crew gives it room to work. Picture yourself at the bow, watching them drop anchor. Here's the move that looks wrong. Instead of dropping the anchor straight down and calling it done, the crew keeps feeding out the chain, way more than the water is even deep, until a long, heavy length of it is lying flat along the seabed. Looks sloppy. It's exactly what makes the system work. Watch what happens when a wave slams into the ship and tries to shove it backward. What stops 200,000 tons? Not the anchor, not at first. The ship has to drag all that heavy chain up off the bottom before the force ever reaches the anchor. And hauling tons of steel off the seafloor eats the wave's energy alive. By the time that force reaches the anchor, it's no longer a sharp punch. It's been stretched into a slower, steadier pull. Exactly the kind of pull the anchor can survive. That chain is a giant shock absorber, a few hundred feet of sagging steel soaking up the ocean's punches one at a time. And there's a bonus. Because the chain lies flat, it pulls the anchor sideways instead of up. And sideways is exactly what drives those flukes deeper into the ground. The harder the ocean pulls, the harder the anchor bites back. That lazy curve of chain even has a name. Engineers call it a catenary. But forget the word, just remember what it does. Without that sag, one big wave could pop the anchor loose and drag the whole ship sideways like a kite with a snapped string. All that force, swallowed by gravity, and a few hundred feet of sagging steel. Beautiful system. Almost foolproof. Almost. Because this whole setup has one fatal flaw. And it's not the weather. It's what's hiding at the very bottom. The flaw is the seabed itself. That genius chain and that razor-sharp anchor are only as good as the ground they land in. Firm sand or good holding mud can lock an anchor in place. The flukes dig down, the chain pulls low, and the whole system settles in. But soft silt, solid rock, coral, or a thick mat of seaweed can ruin the entire plan. Instead of digging in, the anchor just skitters across the top like a hockey puck on ice. Nothing to grab, nothing to hold. And that's the nightmare every captain quietly dreads. When the anchor loses its grip, it doesn't warn you. It just starts skipping along the bottom and the whole ship begins to slide. Slow, silent, invisible in the dark. It's called dragging anchor. It's how a ship parked in a dead calm at midnight ends up scraping a pier at 3 in the morning. A slow motion disaster nobody notices until the metal starts tearing. So how do you stop it? It comes down to one thing: knowing exactly how much chain is out. And this is the part that feels weirdly low-tech. We live in the age of GPS, satellites, and ships that can practically dock themselves. But one of the ways crews track anchor chains underwater still feels like something from the pirate era. They paint it. A common system looks like this. The chain is split into sections called shots. Each shot is about 90 feet, 27 meters. At the joints, the crew uses painted links and connecting shackles as a code. Red marks the break. White links tell you how many shots are out. One white link means one shot. 2 white links means 2 shots. 3 means 3. Near the end, the colors usually get louder, yellow, then red, because red means one thing: stop. You're nearly at the bitter end. So yes, somebody at the bow literally watches the colors slide past and calls them out. All that steel, all that cargo, all that technology, and one of the most important readouts on the ship is still paint on a chain. Low tech, a little ridiculous, and surprisingly hard to improve. But say you nail it. The anchor digs in, the count reads right, you survive the night. Congratulations, now you have the opposite problem. You're chained to the ocean floor by a multi-ton hook buried in mud, and if you just yank straight up, you'll tear your own equipment apart. So how do you break free? The trick is, you don't pull the anchor out from where you are, you move the ship. Trying to rip a buried multi-ton anchor straight up is a terrible idea. The seabed can grip it with so much suction and resistance that the winch alone may not be enough. So the crew cheats. They drive the ship slowly forward until it's sitting almost directly above the anchor. Now the chain runs straight up and down. That vertical pull peels the anchor out of the seabed. Sailors call it breaking out. The engine moves the ship, the winch lifts the chain, split the job in 2, and the impossible gets easy. This is also why a ship can't anchor just anywhere. Out in the open ocean, where the water is a couple of miles deep, anchoring is basically off the table. The deeper the water gets, the more chain you would need. And at some point, the chain itself becomes the problem. Too much weight hanging from the bow, too much load on the windlass, too little margin for error. For many commercial ships, once you get near a few hundred feet of water, anchoring stops being routine and starts becoming a special operation. So what do you do when the water is just too deep to anchor at all? You build an anchor out of software. It's called dynamic positioning. Instead of dropping anything, the ship constantly reads its own position from GPS and a stack of sensors: wind, current, motion, heading, then fires thrusters to cancel out whatever the ocean is doing. No chain, no seabed, just constant corrections. That's how a drill ship can sit over a wellhead in deep water. It's also how some vessels can hold position near places where dropping an anchor would be dangerous, illegal, or an ecological disaster. But here's the thing. Physics doesn't retire just because software showed up. Most ships still rely on the old system because a chain doesn't run out of battery, crash, or lose its GPS signal, and a dragging anchor can still do modern damage. In the Baltic Sea, investigators have spent the last few years looking at a string of damaged power and data cables, and in several cases, dragging anchors became part of the suspicion. Some cases may have been accidents, some are still politically explosive. Either way, it proves the point. A dumb piece of steel dragging across the seabed can still cut through the invisible infrastructure of the modern world. The old heavy chain isn't going anywhere. The best crews don't pick a side. They trust the software, and they respect the chain. And the last detail is almost too perfect. The chain has an emergency escape hatch. The final end of the chain is secured inside the chain locker by a strong but releasable fitting. That is the bitter end. And the system is designed so the crew can slip the entire chain from an accessible position outside the locker during an emergency. Why would anyone dump their own anchor? Because sometimes it's that or lose the ship. In a brutal storm, if the anchor won't come up and the ship is being driven toward the rocks, the crew can release the whole thing, anchor, chain, all of it, and let it disappear into the sea. They may drop a buoy and come back for it later, but a lost anchor costs a fortune, and a fortune is pocket change next to a sunken ship. A lot of people trace the phrase back to that old nautical image, the cable run all the way out to the bits, though language historians still argue about the exact origin. And honestly, it's hard to imagine a better metaphor. So circle back to the question we started with. How does something so small hold back something so enormous? It doesn't, not by itself. The anchor is just the hook on the end. The real work is spread across all that hidden chain on the sea floor. Gravity, friction, a lazy curve, and a little quiet physics nobody ever sees. So next time you see a container ship sitting almost motionless, remember, it's not being held by one giant hook. It's being held by geometry, gravity, and the resistance of the ground beneath it, all hidden under the water. And if there's another everyday machine you want ruined in the best possible way, drop it in the comments. That's usually where my next video comes from. If this made you look twice at something you'd never think about, do me a favor. Hit like, subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next one.